Thank you for being here. My name is Kenza, and I'm going to be talking about React Native. But you probably already know that. So first things first, let's get to know each other. So I started software development about 3 years ago. I'm self-taught, and I started with iOS development. And the company where I started working, Samsao, the first company I worked at, were really big into native apps. To them, anything but native apps basically sucked. On the side, it was kind of like a secret because they were like so against React Native. On the side, I started working with it a little bit. And I was secretly trying to push it, but they were really against it at first. It was basically like a swear word. And eventually, I got lucky. There was a client. They had this app that they wanted in iOS and Android, and they had half the budget that our clients usually do. So it was the perfect opportunity to try it out. And now, at Samsao, we're big fans of React Native apps, and we try to convince clients to do their apps in React Native. So now about you guys. I want everyone who has experience with web development to raise their hand. All right, a lot of web developers. And what about native mobile app development? Cool. What about no development at all? All right, that's good to know. One more question. Raise your hand if you've tried out or at least looked a little bit into React Native. All right, not that many of you. That's good for me, so if I screw up, it won't be that bad. All right. So let's start with what is React Native. So you probably know a little bit about it, but I'm still going to start from the beginning. So React Native is a cross-platform mobile app development library. It allows you to write apps with iOS, Android, even tvOS. And you can extend that to web apps using external libraries like React XP and React Native Web. You can also make that desktop apps using Electron. So basically, you can have one code base and share a huge amount of it between many different platforms. It was built by Facebook, and they released it about 3 years ago. And since then, it's become really popular. For a library that young, it's crazy to see how many huge companies are actually using it nowadays. How is it different from Cordova, Ionic, and PhoneGap? So maybe you've heard of some of these frameworks. They're hybrid mobile app development frameworks. And they have a bad rep. This is why Samsao didn't like hybrid apps, because when they heard React Native, they're like, oh, it's just another one like those. And the way they work is that they basically take a website, put it in a web view, ship it in an app, and people can download it. So at the end of the day, what these are just websites wrapped around an app. So the UX is terrible. Facebook initially went with hybrid apps because they didn't want to have to do native apps. And it was terrible. It was a terrible user experience, and they had to switch to native apps eventually. So the difference is that with React Native, at the end of the day, what you're getting is a native app. When you're calling views, they're calling native views. It's not a website, it's a native app. Every element on the screen is native. So the UX, incidentally, is just a lot better. Xamarin. Xamarin is another cross-platform mobile library framework, and it's close to React Native in that at the end of the day, you do get a native app. It's not like one of those hybrid frameworks, but I personally haven't done much Xamarin, but from what I've heard of people who have, is that the developer experience is pretty bad. So usually you're going to be building your UI, and because it takes so long to actually reflect that UI on a phone or on a simulator, you just don't. You just will develop until the end, and then you'll actually try it out at the end because it takes so long. With React Native, you get awesome tools like hot reloading, where you just press save and you see it directly reflected in your device. So that definitely improves iteration. And another big difference is that when Facebook created React Native, one important thing was to be able to add it to a native app, because they have probably the biggest native app code base in the world with their iOS and Android apps, and they didn't want to have to rewrite everything. So they needed it to be something what they were creating, they needed it to be something that they could plug into a native app and then continue the rest of the development in React Native. So that's why you can do that with React Native. So you can just add it to an app and continue the development in React Native. How is it different from React? Pretty much not different at all. So if you know React, you'll feel right at home with React Native. The syntax is pretty much the same. You mostly just replace div for view, p for text, and other things like that, but it's pretty similar. What about iOS and Android development? So there's a few native developers here. So I'm not going to say bad things about native development. I mean, I started with the native app development. Of course, the first thing is that you can do things twice as fast because you can do them in one code base and it's shared. Personally, with iOS, I didn't have the best developer experience. I found that it was very constricted to what Apple wanted. And the thing is, Apple makes things for them, not for what they call third-party developers, iOS developers. So at the end of the day, what you're getting is what works for Apple. So Apple makes apps that have a backend using iCloud. They don't actually have a backend that is written in JSON. So there's a lot of things that just don't feel natural when you're trying to write an app for iOS and Android with the native iOS. So I feel like personally, React Native feels more intuitive. When you're trying to write a web, an API powered app, when you're trying to call APIs and backends, React Native just feels a lot more natural. There's a lot of things when you're trying to get a backend call and update your view based on that backend call. With native, you can't really do that automatically. You can add libraries like Reactive RX to be able to automatically do that. But by default, you get a backend call, manually write a line to update your view. And with React Native, it's built into it so that when you get something, it updates your view. I'm not going to go too much into the details of that, but it's basically made for that. Another difference is that you can share a lot of your logic with the web. I always found it ridiculous that you're writing, basically, if you have a web app, you have an iOS app, and you have an Android app, you have so much logic that's written in 3 different languages, and that's basically the exact same logic. You're wasting a lot of people's time having to rewrite that logic over and over again. And that's the thing you can avoid with React Native, because it's all in JavaScript, you can share a lot of your logic. Anything that's not view-related, you can share with the web. And overall, I found the developer experience in terms of tooling a lot better in JavaScript. Because, for example, for iOS, we used to have Xcode plugins that allowed you to power up your development. So you press save, and it's going to update the styling of all your files. Then in Xcode 8, Apple took that away for security reasons. So now you can no longer do that. But with JavaScript, everything you use is open source, down to your code editor. So you don't like something in your code editor, well, open a PR and fix it, or fork it and add things to it. You can do anything you want because everything is open source. So yeah, just overall, I feel like you iterate a lot faster when you go with React Native as opposed to a native app. So if I were to write an app that's iOS only, I don't even need to do it in Android, I would still do it in React Native because it would be a lot faster. So when developing with iOS, this is basically what it's like. It takes forever, so minutes. I've heard as long as 40 minutes to see your changes reflected in your app, which is insane. Like, you're simply updating a string, and you have to wait like minutes for it to compile. It's insane. I've heard it's gotten better over the years, but it's still pretty bad. With React Native, there's tools that allow you to do this. So you can have 4 different devices, 3 different sizes of iOS, 1 Android device, and you press save, they all get updated at the same time. Your development speed just downright increases dramatically because you get tools like these. So how does React Native work? I'm not going to go too much into the details, but I'm going to give a little bit of an overview. So what Facebook built is something they call a bridge. This goes into the native app. So you're writing code in JavaScript, and then the bridge sends over calls to the native app and returns those calls. So basically, this is how the native app and JavaScript are communicating. And that's basically the way it works is that you're calling a view in React Native, and this bridge fetches that view from iOS. It calls, get me a view. iOS returns a UI view, and Android returns it a view. So that's kind of the way it works. And the idea behind that is that anybody can add anything to it. React Native by default doesn't have that much inside of it. APIs, camera, you want to add a camera. React Native doesn't have that in their base library. But there's a library for that. There's an external library you can add for this. There's one for maps, there's one for cameras to control your flashlight. Any APIs that you can think of that you want to access in native, there's probably a library for it, and if there isn't, you can make one, because that's how they wanted it to be built. They didn't want all the Facebook developers to have all the control and nobody else can add something. They have the community has to ask for it and wait for it. No, you don't have to wait. You can just build it yourself. So when I started out with React Native, initially I was a little skeptical. I was like, I don't know, like hybrid development frameworks, they're generally not good. You get bad user experience. And you know what? JavaScript doesn't have a good reputation. So I wasn't really feeling it, especially I started out with Swift. So I was like comparing Swift with JavaScript, and there's no way I could switch. But I started looking into it a little bit, just out of curiosity. And after a couple of weeks, you know what? I was kind of impressed. I was like, you know what? There's so many things that I can do so much faster. And eventually, I got to love it so much that I started the meetup around it. I do a newsletter around it. I give talks about it. I just love it a lot. So a lot of people feel the way this guy feels. They're like, I'm not sure about this thing. And some people have tried it out, but maybe they tried it out 2 years ago when it was in its infancy. And it was terrible because it was just starting out. And they just made up their minds about it. I heard a lot of people come to the React Native meetup and be like, you know what? I tried it out a little while ago, and it's pretty bad. I don't think I'd want to make my MVP in it. And I don't agree. So this is why we're going to debunk some myths. First of all, JavaScript sucks. Well, you know what? A lot of people who are coming from statically typed language, like Swift, like Kotlin, like Java, they think JavaScript is a hellhole. You try to read a function, but it doesn't have any types, and you have no idea what's going on. And there's all those quirks with JavaScript and all of that. But at the end of the day, JavaScript now is not where it was 10, 15 years ago. It has evolved a lot. And if you compare it to other languages like PHP or Java, it's a lot more modern feeling. There's tools like ESLint and Prettier to catch errors in your code and fix them automatically when you press save. There's Babel that brings the features of the latest JavaScript called ECMAScript versions for the past couple of years that actually can rival with the newest, fanciest languages like Swift and Kotlin. And there's TypeScript and Flow that can add types to your JavaScript, so that basically takes away the issue of JavaScript not having types. And there's Jest that allows you to run your tests, very, very powerful tests that are kind of hard to do if you're using Swift. Another preconception is that React Native apps suck. And this is how people think React Native is. They're like, I'm trying to do something, it doesn't work, and you know what, I'm just going to give up. But at the end of the day, React Native apps can be just as good as native apps. And to me, I feel like a lot of people who feel that way, you give them an app in React Native, and the thing is, they won't see the difference between the iOS app, but only if it was built by people who actually know what they're doing a little bit. As in, to me, you need to have at least one person who knows both platforms, whether it's a UX person, a design person, a developer, it doesn't matter. It needs to be somebody who understands both platforms. And the thing is, because React Native is built on top of React, it's very popular amongst web developers. And web developers usually work with web designers. And then you have both these people trying to make a native app, and it just doesn't feel right. But the thing is, if they try to make a native app, it probably wouldn't be any better, because at the end of the day, it's the UX, it's not the framework. So my opinion is just, you need to have at least one person who knows a little bit about platforms and who knows, like in an Android app, you shouldn't put a back button at the top because there's a back button in the hardware, so it won't feel right. So just somebody who knows a little bit about that. That's all you need. And yes, it's true, React Native performance is not as good as native. It's logical. React Native is built on top of native, and if you're at the lowest level, it's always better in terms of performance. But performance actually doesn't matter that much. For 99% of apps you're going to do, your social media app, your food delivery app, whatever it is, your users won't care about performance. They won't see any difference at all. Performance benchmarks only matter for apps that need just very strong processing. For example, if you're making a video processing app or an app that deals with audio processing, things like that. Sure, yeah, you can win a little bit by saving on this tiny little difference of performance. But for the rest of the apps, it actually doesn't matter at all. Another assumption is that React Native is not ready for production. The truth is React Native is not even at version 1.0 yet. Technically, they're at version 0.53. Well, that brings about the question, are they ready for production if they don't even consider themselves 1.0? Well, they disagree. From Wix to Tesla to Walmart, well, Facebook obviously, Airbnb, all these people made apps in React Native and they loved it. There's other people such as the team at Artsy, the guys who made Cocoa Pods, they switched to React Native 100%. They don't even have an Android app. And they just switched because it allowed them to have a better developer experience. So if they think it's ready for production, there's no app that you could think of that you want to make that it won't be ready for. Now, React Native is not perfect for everything. Like I was saying, for video processing and audio processing, things like that, you probably shouldn't go with React Native. You're going to have more trouble trying to deal with that. Another issue I had a few months ago, I did the Bluetooth app for one of my clients. They wanted an app that had very minimal UI. It was just a couple of screens. You press on a button, you connect to a device, you press on another button, it sends a few information over Bluetooth, done. So I had like 5 screens total. But it was very Bluetooth intensive. And React Native, like I was saying, doesn't have a lot of APIs in and of itself. So there is an external library for Bluetooth in React Native, but it's very basic. You can scan around your environment, you can do a few things, you can send a few simple commands, but if you're trying to send multiple commands, one after the other, and you're trying to send a long message, and in Bluetooth there's a limit that you can send over, and you need to chop it into chunks, and it gets complicated. And that library doesn't handle that. I tried forking the library, adding features to it, but my Android knowledge is pretty limited, so it didn't go that well. So at the end of the day, I just told the client, you know what, we're going to go with native here, because it's just going to take too much time to try to figure it out. In my opinion, if you have a Bluetooth app, but it has a lot of UI, like there's a lot of screens, it needs to be beautiful, all of that stuff, yeah, sure, try to go with React Native, try to add some things to that Bluetooth library. But if you don't, and it's a very simple UI app, then you're better off just going native. It's going to be faster at the end of the day. And also another thing is if you have an app that has a lot of extensions. So if you have an app that needs an Apple Watch, widgets, things like that, these are a lot of things that are not available by default in React Native. So you are going to have to tinker around a lot to get that working. So I would say probably go with native in those cases. Is there a catch? Now, I think someone said last year in one of these talks that no technology is perfect, and we got to talk about what's wrong. So React Native does have flaws. And one of the biggest ones is related to navigation. This is one of the biggest known problems in React Native because they started out with the navigation library embedded in React Native, but they started it back when it was only iOS was handled because Android was actually added a year after iOS. And so it would only work with iOS. So what happened is that when Android came out, nobody could use that anymore. And then they went through like maybe 5 or 6 different navigation libraries. And right now, the most popular one is called React Navigation, but the issue is that it's made in JavaScript. It's trying to simulate putting one view on top of another, but it's not actually native. So in terms of performance, you're losing quite a bit because what native does in iOS, for example, is that you're putting views on top of each other, and it's making sure that the previous view is not still active so that you can gain in performance. But in React Native, that's not the case, at least with React Navigation, because it's just putting views on top of each other, and they all get re-rendered if you change something. So in terms of performance, that's not the best. There's other libraries for navigation that do use native, and they're a little better, but in terms of developer experience of implementing them, they're not as easy. So that's something that's still, there's no proper solution for it in React Native, and they're still working towards that. There's also a problem with the React Native packager in terms of caching, but that's only in development. But when you're developing, there's been so many times I'm developing something, or let's say I'm trying to fix a bug. So I change something in the code, I think it's gonna fix it for sure. I save, oh, well, I guess it didn't fix it. But it did, I just needed to reload twice because there's a caching issue. And that was just, it caused a lot of issues in terms of somebody thought it worked and then they pushed it and they opened a PR, but actually it didn't because they broke something, but the caching issue prevented them from actually seeing that. So that's something like we had to be aware of, and we always reload twice to make sure that we don't make those mistakes. There's also some inconsistencies between platforms. And the thing is, iOS and Android are different, sure, in terms of UX, in terms of usability, but also in terms of APIs. And there's some issues that we've had that just didn't make any sense. Like you're trying to put a view on top of another one, but then in iOS, the view takes the size of its parent, and in Android, it takes the size of its grandparent. And it was just like issues that didn't make any sense. They're few and far between, but when you get those, you get mad. So these are some issues that we've had to deal with. Of course, React Native always improves. There's a new version every couple of weeks, but there are things that you should be aware of. So, you know, it has issues, but at the end of the day, it's not bad for a library that's not even a version 1.0. So this is my 2 cents on React Native. Personally, like I said, I don't think I will make a native app again unless I needed to make a Bluetooth app or a video processing app. I'll probably just go with React Native just because it's faster, even if it's iOS only. And at the end of the day, you won't get a poor user experience or anything like that by going with React Native. So just make sure you have somebody that knows what they're doing in your team. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, like somebody that's there full-time, or you're hiring a contractor, UX contractor that knows about iOS and Android. Just have somebody who knows what they're doing when you're starting out. It can go a long way. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. Yes. Hey.
What's the biggest challenge you've had with React Native?
The biggest challenge, I would say probably navigation. Especially last year. Now that library for navigation, the most popular one is at version 1.0, and it's fixed a few bugs. But last year, I spent maybe 2 weeks trying to figure out how to prevent the user from going back to the splash screen on Android. It was just driving me crazy because there were things that were just lacking in that library that are fixed now, but there's still some other issues with navigation. So I would say that's probably the biggest pain point I've had. Yes?
So would you say that you want an app that is based on
It depends how complex. If you have things that, like Pinterest, let's say, when you're pressing on something and it expands and things like that, maybe. Maybe at this stage I would be like, okay, maybe it's not quite there yet and I don't want to have to fight for it so much. Yeah, go for it.
Could you said React Native could be plugged in an app that's already scoping like a basic application in it?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
You said that React Native could be plugged in an app that's native, that's built native. So could you sort of do a mix of both?
Yeah, you definitely could. Like I said, when I said maybe not right now, I meant with the library that's in JavaScript for navigation, but there's other libraries that allow you to have the native navigation, so it allows you to have the same navigation that you would have on a native app. But they're just a little bit more difficult to use, but not that difficult. So you could probably do that, or you could do create a native app and then add React Native for things UI related. Yeah. Yes.
So if I have a simple web application done in React, and now I'd like to do it in React Native, how do I start? Can I reuse the same project? Because so I'm saying I'm going to reuse the containers, the API calls, or do I have to start from over and just take some of the code that JavaScript code and port it back? Can I use the same Webpack? Can I use the same
Okay, good question. At Samsung, most of the projects we've had with React Native actually had a web app as well. So we keep it in the same repo. And so we have this folder called common, and that has all the common code. So let's say you have your web app and React. I would say take anything that you can share that's not UI related, any Redux logic, any API calls, any functions that make anything just business logic related, and put them in that folder. And then you'd have the web folder and you have a mobile folder. You can't really reuse the Webpack. I mean, you can. There's a library called Hall. It's an alternative to React Native Packager because people had issues with the packager, like I was saying, caching issues, things like that. And that uses Webpack. So you can reuse a little bit of your Webpack configuration as well. Yeah, I would say you can definitely do that.
But for instance, components we can't reuse because of course they're used, but are containers reusable?
Yes, definitely. Definitely reusable. I use containers. Anything that doesn't use just the GSX that's React or React Native related, you can share. So something that we're talking about with my colleagues, which we haven't implemented yet, but maybe create a component that has all the logic and has a few functions like render header, render footer, render content, and then just inherit from that component in web, inherit from that component in native, and just override these functions. Because at the end of the day, they're both using React components, and the GSX is the only thing that's different.
What about routers?
Routers is different.
That's going to be more complicated.
There is the React router. If you're using React router, it does support React Native, but it's not very popular, so I don't know if you can expect a lot of support from that.
I use the React router, Saga, but
Okay.
I don't know if that works. Probably not.
Yeah, I would say you'd have to look it up, but you should go for a React Native solution for a router. Yeah, of course.
I have more of a psychotherapy/business question.
All right.
So I've had to suffer through teams being on Xamarin, and it cost us actually quite a few people on the team that left. I thought at the time that it was suicidal anyways because it was buggy. How would I take developers, and communicate with them? Everything's going to be fine. Let's do this.
Ooh, that's a tough one. So, I mean,
Right now it's kind of like you were dedicated to one platform. I forced you into something else that you hated, and I'm going to force you into this new thing that's supposed to be awesome, but I already promised you that once, didn't I?
Yeah, that is a hard one. To be honest, at Samsung, we did have one person leave because that guy was just super into iOS. And when we asked him to do React Native, he tried it, and I was like, oh my God, I hate JavaScript, I can't do this. And he just like left after a few months. You know, if you have developers that are very just stuck into what they like, it's a little hard to convince them otherwise. But, you know, I would say if they're already using Xamarin, there's just going to be a huge relief when they start using React Native that you won't have to deal with that problem so much. Yeah, I would say just motivating them is a little bit trickier because, you know, they're developers, they have problems, they have to solve them. That's what a developer's job is. So I would say just try to convince them to give it a try, see that it's better than Xamarin, and then, you know, if it doesn't work out, give me a call. All right, yes?
I'm thinking how to like, okay, I've never done mobile.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just new on web development. And you're talking a lot about like how JavaScript sucks. From your point of view of mobile, it seems, because of the languages that you use to develop native.
I was saying that I don't think it sucks, but people think it sucks. Yeah. Yeah.
Then, let's say I want to start with mobile and we're learning about that. We see that React Native is a good way to do it. Like, since I'm coming from web development and I'm a little used to like JavaScript and that kind of languages.
Oh, I would say for sure. That's why it's been widely popular, because a lot of web developers can contribute. And for example, I've heard a lot of companies where adding React Native made their teams in general more cohesive. Because you had your Android developers, your iOS developers, and your web developers, and they all worked on different things, and they were not communicating that much. But then everybody can contribute. You start an app with React Native, they all have the same code base, and there's a lot more cohesion. But I would say if you have web developer experience, you're definitely going to feel a lot more at home with React Native as opposed to native. I would say the learning curve is a lot bigger on native. Just in general, because Kotlin and Swift are not that difficult to learn in terms of languages, but there's a huge framework behind it. And there's a lot to know if you're building something in native. But in React Native, there's tools. For example, Expo, that's a tool with React that was built for React Native that's made for web developers. Because if you're creating an app just with raw React Native, you have your iOS folder, you have your Android folder, and that has native code inside of it. Swift, and sorry, not Swift, Objective-C and Java files. But with Expo, they take care of all of that for you. You start your app, and you're basically doing it like a website. You can ship it with a URL, and anybody can install it on their phone. So there's tools like that were made for web developers to have a much easier time dealing with all the build systems and things like that. So if you're using Expo, you shouldn't have to go into the native code. Well, actually, there's no native code, so you can't go into the native code. So I would say you should definitely start with React Native. If you need something more complex, let's say you're trying to add a library for managing the flashlight, you might need to go away from Expo, because Expo doesn't allow you to do things like that. But and you might have to write a little bit of native code, but it usually won't be anything too complex that you won't be able to do it. You know, like we've had web developers on our team do some things like that. So I would say definitely React Native could be a good option for you. Yes.
I'm curious, do you have experiences with mixed native and React Native? Because I think it's Instagram or Airbnb, but I think that they just started to go to React Native for some sprints of all the apps. So I'm curious if you have that kind of experiences, or you just started for the project from scratch.
I've just started for projects from scratch. I have looked into Artsy, like I was saying, the guys who built the CocoaPods, they did that. And their projects are all open source, so I looked into their code to see how they did it. And it seems pretty, it's not that difficult to do. Like, it's not that difficult to add React Native. And the thing is, that's the point. You don't want to have to rewrite your whole app. You just want to plug it in, and then the future screens that you do develop, they're in React Native. Yeah, I could share those open source code bases, so that definitely makes it easier to see how somebody else did it. But personally, I don't have experience actually implementing it. Anything else? Nope? All right, thank you very much.